In 1908, Manhattan was in the middle of the greatest building race the world had ever seen. Architects and industrialists were competing to build taller, grander, more ambitious structures than anyone thought possible. Every few months, a new building would claim the title of world's tallest, only to be surpassed by another tower rising somewhere else in the city. But one building stood out from all the rest. The Singer Building, designed by architect Ernest Flagg and commissioned by the Singer Manufacturing Company, reached 612 feet into the New York sky. For one glorious year, from 1908 to 1909, it was the tallest building on Earth. Before we continue, subscribe for real stories about forgotten landmarks and the history cities tried to erase. The Singer Company didn't need the world's tallest building to sell sewing machines. They were already one of the most successful manufacturing companies in America, with factories and showrooms across the globe. But Isaac Singer, the company's founder, understood something fundamental about American capitalism. Height meant power, visibility meant dominance, and a building that touched the clouds meant your company had arrived. Ernest Flagg, the architect chosen to design this monument, was known for something unusual in the world of early skyscrapers. While other architects were cramming as much office space as possible into their towers, creating dark, claustrophobic buildings that blocked out the sun, Flagg believed in elegance. He believed in light. He believed that a building should be beautiful, not just profitable. The Singer Building wasn't just tall. It was a masterpiece of the Beaux-Arts style, covered in red brick and limestone, with ornate detailing that made it look more like a French mansion stretched toward the heavens than a typical New York office tower. The tower itself was slender, almost delicate, rising from a much larger base building that occupied an entire city block. At the top, a distinctive mansard roof gave the building a crown that could be seen from miles away. When it opened in 1908, New Yorkers were stunned. This wasn't just another office building. This was architecture as art, commerce as culture, ambition made physical. Thousands of people worked inside its 47 floors. The Singer Company used it as their headquarters, their showroom, and their statement to the world that they were building the future. But here's what nobody could have predicted in 1908. The future they were building wouldn't last 60 years. The Singer Building, the tallest building in the world, the masterpiece of Ernest Flagg, the crown jewel of American architecture, would be completely demolished by 1968. Torn down floor by floor, brick by brick, until nothing remained but photographs and memories. And to this day, it still holds one record that will probably never be broken. The Singer Building remains the tallest building ever peacefully demolished in human history. This is the story of how America built something extraordinary, then destroyed it for profit. Ernest Flagg didn't set out to build the tallest building in the world. He set out to solve a problem that was destroying New York City. By the early 1900s, Manhattan had become a canyon of darkness. Skyscrapers were rising everywhere, but they were being built with one goal in mind, which was to maximize rentable square footage. Architects would design massive rectangular towers that occupied their entire lots, rising straight up from the street without any setbacks or tapers. The result was that sunlight couldn't reach the streets anymore. Entire neighborhoods were plunged into permanent shadow. Flagg hated this. He believed that buildings had a responsibility to the city around them, not just to their owners. So when the Singer Company approached him about designing their new headquarters, he proposed something radical. Instead of building a massive tower that covered the entire lot, he would build a slender tower rising from a wider base. The tower itself would be only 65 feet wide, allowing light and air to flow around it. This wasn't just about aesthetics. Flagg was making an argument about what cities should look like, about how capitalism and beauty could coexist. The Singer Building would prove that you could build tall and profitable while still creating something that enhanced the city rather than suffocating it. The construction process was a marvel of engineering. The building used a steel frame, which was still a relatively new technology in 1908. Workers riveted thousands of steel beams together, creating a skeleton that could support the enormous weight of 47 floors of brick, limestone, and marble. The foundation had to be driven deep into the Manhattan bedrock because the building's slender tower created unusual stress points that earlier, wider buildings didn't have. 12 workers died during construction. This was considered acceptable at the time. Building skyscrapers in the early 1900s was one of the most dangerous jobs in America, and construction companies rarely faced consequences for worker deaths. The men who built the Singer Building, many of them recent immigrants, were paid about $2 per day to risk their lives connecting steel beams hundreds of feet in the air with no safety harnesses and minimal safety protocols. When the building was finally completed, it cost $4 million, which would be roughly $120 million today. The Singer Company spared no expense on the interiors. The lobby featured marble columns, ornate plasterwork, and detailed mosaics. The executive offices on the upper floors had mahogany paneling and custom furniture. This wasn't just a workplace. It was a cathedral to American industry. Ernest Flagg believed he had created something that would last centuries. Buildings like this, he thought, were permanent additions to the city. After all, who would ever tear down the tallest building in the world? The answer would come sooner than anyone expected. If you're enjoying the story so far, make sure you're subscribed for more true history like this. The Singer Building held the title of world's tallest building for exactly 1 year and 2 months. In 1909, the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company completed their tower just a few blocks north, reaching 700 feet and claiming the record for themselves. But losing the height record didn't matter much to the Singer Company. They had achieved their goal, which wasn't really about being the tallest. It was about visibility, prestige, and creating a landmark that would make people think of Singer whenever they looked at the Manhattan skyline. And for decades, that's exactly what happened. The Singer Building became one of New York's most recognizable landmarks, its distinctive red facade and mansard roof appearing in countless photographs, postcards, and paintings. Tourists would visit Lower Manhattan specifically to see the Singer Building. Architects would study it as an example of how to build tall without sacrificing beauty. The building was also incredibly successful as a commercial property. The Singer Company occupied several floors for their corporate offices and showrooms, but they rented out most of the space to other businesses. Office space in the Singer Building commanded premium rents because of the building's prestige and because Flagg's design meant that every office had natural light, which was rare in early skyscrapers. For the first few decades of its existence, everything seemed perfect. The building was profitable, iconic, and structurally sound. There was no reason to think it wouldn't stand for centuries, just like the great cathedrals of Europe that had inspired Flagg's Beaux-Arts design. But beneath the surface, economic forces were already shifting in ways that would eventually doom the Singer Building. The first problem was that the building's most celebrated feature, its slender tower, was also its fatal flaw from a purely financial perspective. Flagg had designed the tower to be only 65 feet wide because he believed in letting light reach the streets. But that meant the upper floors had relatively little rentable space compared to newer, bulkier towers that were being built throughout Manhattan. By the 1920s and 30s, New York's zoning laws had changed to allow even taller buildings, and new construction techniques made it possible to build bigger, faster, and cheaper than when the Singer Building was constructed. The Empire State Building, completed in 1931, had 85 floors and vastly more rentable square footage than the Singer Building, despite occupying a similar amount of land. The second problem was location. When the Singer Building opened in 1908, Lower Manhattan was the unquestioned center of New York's business district. But over the following decades, the city's commercial center gradually shifted north toward Midtown. Companies wanted office space near Grand Central Terminal and the new subway lines, not down near Wall Street. The Singer Company itself started having financial problems during the Great Depression. The market for sewing machines was declining as factory-made clothing became cheaper and more accessible. By the 1950s, Singer was no longer the industrial powerhouse it had been in 1908. The building that had once symbolized the company's dominance was becoming a burden. In 1961, the Singer Company sold their namesake building to a group of real estate investors for about $7 million, which was actually less than twice what it had cost to build 50 years earlier, when you adjusted for inflation. This should have been a warning sign about what was coming. The new owners looked at the Singer Building and saw something very different than what Ernest Flagg had envisioned. They didn't see a masterpiece of architecture. They didn't see a landmark that enhanced the city. They saw an inefficient use of valuable Manhattan real estate. They saw a beautiful old building occupying land that could support something much more profitable, and so they started making plans. In 1965, the real estate investors who had purchased the Singer Building announced their intentions. They were going to demolish it completely and replace it with a new tower that would be bigger, plainer, and far more profitable. The reaction from the architectural community was immediate and furious. How could anyone even consider destroying one of New York's most beautiful buildings? How could you tear down a masterpiece of Beaux-Arts architecture that was barely 60 years old? How could you demolish a building that was structurally sound and still perfectly functional? The answers came down to mathematics and money. The Singer Building occupied approximately 85,000 square feet of land in Lower Manhattan, some of the most valuable real estate in the world. But because of Flagg's slender tower design, the building contained only roughly 350,000 square feet of rentable office space. The developers had hired an architectural firm to design a replacement, and the numbers told a compelling story. A new building using modern construction techniques could occupy the same land and contain over 1 million square feet of office space. That was 3 times more rentable area, which meant 3 times more rent, which meant much higher profits. There was no law preventing this. New York didn't have meaningful historic preservation laws in 1965. The Landmarks Preservation Commission had only been created that same year, largely in response to the destruction of the original Pennsylvania Station, another architectural masterpiece that had been demolished a few years earlier. Preservationists tried to get the Singer Building designated as a landmark, which would have protected it from demolition. But the building's owners fought this designation, arguing that it would be an unconstitutional restriction on their property rights. And they had powerful allies. The construction industry, real estate developers, and various business groups all supported the demolition because they saw historic preservation as a threat to profit. In the end, the preservationists lost. The Singer Building would not receive landmark protection. The developers were free to tear it down and build whatever would make them the most money. The announcement of the demolition plan created a strange moment in New York history. Suddenly, thousands of people who had walked past the Singer Building every day without really noticing it began to see it differently. Newspapers ran articles about the building's history, its architectural significance, and the tragedy of losing it. Photographers took pictures, trying to document what would soon be gone forever. But public sentiment didn't matter. This was still an era when most people believed that progress meant tearing down the old to make room for the new. The idea that a 60-year-old building could be worth preserving seemed sentimental, even naive, to many New Yorkers. After all, the city had always been about reinvention, about destroying what came before to build something bigger and more modern. The demolition was scheduled to begin in 1967. The new building would be called One Liberty Plaza, and it would be utterly unremarkable in every way except its size. No ornate details, no distinctive roof, no architectural ambition, beyond maximizing rentable square footage. It would be exactly the kind of building that Ernest Flagg had spent his career arguing against. But first, they had to destroy his masterpiece. Tearing down a 47-story building in the middle of Manhattan is extraordinarily complicated and dangerous. You can't just place explosives and blow it up like they do in other cities. The Singer Building was surrounded by other structures, some of them nearly as tall, and there were subway tunnels running directly beneath it. The demolition contract went to a New Jersey company that specialized in deconstructing large buildings. Their approach was methodical and brutal. They would start at the top and work their way down, floor by floor, removing everything valuable and then tearing apart what remained. The first stage was salvage. Workers went through every floor, removing anything that could be sold. Light fixtures, radiators, marble panels, copper wiring, decorative ironwork. Anything that had value was stripped out and sold to salvage yards. This included much of the beautiful interior detailing that had made the Singer Building special. Mahogany paneling from executive offices, marble from the lobby, even the ornate elevator doors, all of it was torn out and sold. Then came the systematic destruction. Workers with jackhammers and cutting torches would break apart one floor at a time, smashing through walls, cutting steel beams and dropping debris down into the center of the building where it would be hauled away by trucks. The process created an enormous amount of dust and noise that blanketed the neighborhood for months. One of the most disturbing aspects of the demolition was how it revealed the building's skeleton. As the outer walls came down, you could see the steel frame that had held up 47 floors for 60 years. The craftsmanship of those early steelworkers was still visible in every rivet, every connection, every beam. The building was as structurally sound in 1967 as it had been in 1908. It wasn't being demolished because it was falling apart. It was being demolished because it wasn't profitable enough. The demolition took approximately 2 years to complete. During that time, the Singer Building became a ghost, a hollow shell of what it had once been. Windows were smashed out, floors were torn away, and the distinctive mansard roof that had crowned the building for 60 years was dismantled piece by piece. Photographers documented the destruction, creating haunting images of a once proud building being systematically destroyed. These photographs are painful to look at even today. You can see the violence of it, the casual brutality of tearing apart something that had taken years to build and had been designed to last forever. The human cost of the demolition was significant, but largely undocumented. Demolition work is dangerous, especially when you're deconstructing a building as tall as the Singer Building. Workers were exposed to asbestos, lead, and other hazardous materials without proper protection. Several workers were injured during the demolition, though exact numbers are hard to find because construction companies had little incentive to report injuries. By late 1968, the Singer Building was gone. 60 years of history, thousands of days of human labor, millions of dollars of craftsmanship, all of it reduced to rubble and hauled away to landfills in New Jersey. In its place, there was just an empty lot waiting for the next building to rise. And rise it did. Construction of One Liberty Plaza began almost immediately. One Liberty Plaza opened in 1973. It was everything the Singer Building was not. Where the Singer Building had been slender and elegant, One Liberty Plaza was blocky and massive. Where Flagg's design had celebrated ornament and detail, the new building was relentlessly plain, covered in black steel and glass with virtually no decoration. Where the Singer Building had been designed to enhance the city, One Liberty Plaza was designed simply to maximize profit. The new building had 54 floors and contained 1.9 million square feet of office space. It was exactly what the developers had promised, which was a much more efficient use of the land. The building generated far more rental income than the Singer Building ever could have, and it was, by almost any aesthetic measure, completely forgettable. One Liberty Plaza is the kind of building you could walk past 100 times and never really notice. It has none of the Singer Building's grace, none of its charm, none of its architectural ambition. It's just a big box designed to hold as many office workers as possible. This is the tragedy at the heart of the Singer Building story. The destruction wasn't necessary because the old building was falling apart. It wasn't necessary because the land was needed for something important. It was simply about money. The developers looked at Ernest Flagg's masterpiece and calculated that they could make more profit by destroying it and building something cheaper and uglier. And they were right, at least in purely financial terms. One Liberty Plaza has been a successful office building for more than 50 years. It houses thousands of workers, generates millions of dollars in rent, and has been profitable for its owners. But something was lost that can never be recovered. The Singer Building was unique. There was nothing else quite like it in New York or anywhere else in the world. Once it was demolished, that particular combination of beauty, ambition, and craftsmanship vanished forever. You could build an exact replica today if you wanted to spend the money. You have the photographs, the architectural drawings, the documentation, but it wouldn't be the same. It wouldn't have the history, the patina of age, the connection to a different era of American capitalism when building owners still believed that architecture mattered. The destruction of the Singer Building happened at a critical moment in American history. Just a few years earlier, New York had demolished Pennsylvania Station, another architectural masterpiece, to make room for the current Madison Square Garden. That demolition sparked outrage and led directly to the creation of New York's Landmarks Preservation Commission, but the Singer Building was demolished anyway. The new preservation laws weren't strong enough or weren't applied aggressively enough to save it. And once it was gone, people began to realize what they had lost. The demolition of the Singer Building became a case study in what not to do. Architectural historians point to it as one of the greatest losses in American architectural history. Preservationists use it as an example of why historic buildings need legal protection from pure economic forces. But the lesson still hasn't fully been learned. Across America, historic buildings continue to be demolished every year because they're not profitable enough, because developers want to build something bigger, or simply because no one values them enough to fight for their preservation. The Singer Building taught us that just because you can tear something down doesn't mean you should. It taught us that there are values beyond profit, qualities like beauty and craftsmanship and historical continuity that matter even if they don't show up on a balance sheet. It also taught us something darker about American capitalism. We live in a system that constantly destroys its own past in pursuit of higher returns. Buildings, neighborhoods, even entire ways of life can be swept away if someone calculates that there's more money to be made by destroying them. The Singer Building still holds its grim record. At 612 feet tall, it remains the tallest building ever peacefully demolished. Several other tall buildings have been destroyed by war, terrorism, or natural disasters, but no building taller than the Singer has ever been deliberately torn down simply because its owners wanted to build something more profitable. It's a record that says something profound about American values. We built the tallest building in the world, created a genuine masterpiece of architecture, and then we tore it down after just 60 years because it wasn't profitable enough. That's the story of the Singer Building, That's also, in many ways, the story of America itself. The Singer Building exists now only in photographs, architectural drawings, and memories that are rapidly fading as the people who actually saw the building in person pass away. If you visit the corner of Liberty Street and Broadway in Lower Manhattan today, you'll find One Liberty Plaza standing where Ernest Flagg's masterpiece once stood. There's a small plaque noting that the Singer Building was once located on this site, but it's easy to miss. Most people who work in the building have no idea what was there before. The building's destruction continues to generate controversy among architectural historians and preservationists. Books have been written about it, documentaries have been made about it, and it's taught in architecture schools as a cautionary tale about what happens when economics are allowed to override all other considerations. Some architectural fragments from the Singer Building survived. A few pieces of ornamental stonework were saved by preservationists and can be seen in museums. Some of the decorative metalwork was salvaged and incorporated into other buildings. But these fragments are all that remains of a structure that once dominated the New York skyline. Ernest Flagg, the architect who designed the building, died in 1947, 20 years before the demolition began. He never had to see his masterpiece destroyed, but his other buildings survived, including the Corcoran Gallery in Washington, D.C., and several notable structures in New York. His legacy as an architect who believed that beauty mattered, that buildings had responsibilities beyond profit, lives on even though his most famous building doesn't. The Singer Manufacturing Company, which commissioned the building and gave it their name, no longer exists as an independent entity. The company was sold and resold multiple times, and the Singer brand name is now owned by a Chinese company that manufactures sewing machines under license. The building that was supposed to symbolize the company's permanence and power lasted longer than the company itself. One Liberty Plaza, the building that replaced the Singer Building, is now considered one of the ugliest buildings in New York. Architecture critics regularly include it on lists of the city's worst buildings. It has none of the Singer Building's elegance, none of its charm, none of the qualities that make buildings worth preserving. And here's the final irony. One Liberty Plaza is now old enough that some preservationists are starting to argue it should be protected as an example of 1970s architecture. The building that destroyed a masterpiece might itself eventually be designated a landmark, not because it's beautiful, but simply because it survived long enough to have historical significance. The Singer Building's ghost haunts Lower Manhattan. Every time another historic building is threatened with demolition, people invoke the Singer Building as a warning. Every time developers argue that an old building should be torn down to make room for something more profitable, preservationists point to the Singer Building and ask whether we really want to make the same mistake again. But mistakes keep happening. Buildings keep being demolished. The pressure to maximize profit, to tear down the old and build the new, remains as strong as ever. The Singer Building was built by people who believed they were creating something permanent, something that would define New York for centuries. They succeeded in creating something extraordinary, but they failed to account for a system that values short-term profit over long-term beauty, that sees buildings not as art or history, but simply as assets to be optimized. That's why the Singer Building matters. Not just because it was beautiful, not just because it was the tallest building in the world, but because its destruction revealed something fundamental about who we are and what we value. We destroyed something irreplaceable because someone calculated they could make more money by building something ordinary. The building is gone. The record remains. And the question it raises still hasn't been answered. What are we willing to preserve, and what are we willing to destroy in the name of progress and profit? For more real stories behind the buildings that shaped and disappeared from our cities, subscribe to the channel